Welcome,
Okay.
everyone. It's always such a pleasure to be learning with you. This class is part of Fall Zman here at Drisha. And again, welcome to the first session of Why Praying Community with Miss Rachael Gelfman Schultz. This wonderful class that we have today, the first class is why is there a mitzvah to pray with a minyan? How does praying in community benefit or detract from my prayer experience? We'll explore those questions. Why are so many of the Jewish prayers are in plural for others and not just for ourselves? Why can we say certain prayers only in a minyan? We will take a closer look at the prayers and parts of the prayer service that we can only say in a minyan, such as Kaddish, the repetition of the Amidah, Kedushah, the priestly blessing, the Torah service, and Haftarah, through the lens of ancient, medieval, and modern thinkers, as a way of exploring the meaning of tefillah in our personal lives and in our communities. Again, Rachael Gelfman Schultz is our speaker today. She's a writer and a Jewish educator specializing in teaching students in the conversion process. Rachael writes, edits, and translates for Jewish nonprofits and Torah publications. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachael.
Thanks, Evie. Great to see you all today, and a bunch of familiar faces from many places, but also from our last class on tefillah, which I think is great because some of the things that we're talking about are definitely going to build on the last class, though it's also fine if you were not there. You will, yeah, so this class is going to be about tefillah and community. Amy raised a very interesting question of the place of women in this community, which we're not going to talk about right now. Maybe later we'll do a class about the sort of the halachic status of women in the prayer community. But for now, we are assuming, at least on that on a conceptual level, that women and children and everyone else are part of the community when we talk about community, even if halachically, according to some, they're not, or at least they're not part of the minyan. Anyway, so what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be exploring the question of why pray in a community? Why is it so important in Judaism? What do we gain and what do we lose by praying in community? But the way we're going to be doing that is each session is going to be devoted to a particular part of the prayers that we can only say in community. So this week we're going to talk about the repetition of the Amidah, the Chazaret Hashatz in Hebrew. And through that, I hope that we're going to get to the larger questions of what are the benefits of praying in community and the drawbacks. So that's today. I thought that the repetition of Amidah was a good place to start for a couple of reasons. One, it actually does continue where we ended off in the last course. We had just finished talking about the Amidah, and now we're talking about the repetition of the Amidah. But two is that it's something that is, I think, challenging for a lot of people. It's basically, we say the entire silent Amidah, or in Hebrew, we call it the whispered Amidah, which is really more accurate, right? And then we repeat the whole thing, and people find it hard to focus, and people talk a lot during the Amidah. As we'll see in our sources, this is something that is not new phenomenon that people talk during the Amidah. This has been going on for many years. So since it's something that I think is a struggle often for us to find meaning in, I thought that we would start from what you know or from what you think, what is the point of the repetition of the Amidah? Why, after each person says the Amidah individually, does then the chazan, the shaliach tzibor, the person leading the service, repeat the whole thing over again with some additions? What do you think?
I'm Amy from Sharon, Mass. And one of the reasons, of course, is because, people they're quietly, they're whispering. You don't assume that everyone is knowledgeable enough to have actually said all the words or said it correctly. So the Shaliach Tzibor says it so that everybody is in fact included and everybody has said it, because by answering Amen, it's as if you did it yourself.
Okay, so this is the classic reason given. I'm going to share the sources. Amy, would you mind reading the first source? I think we're going to read the sources in English, and when we need to, since I'm not assuming that everyone knows the Hebrew, but when we need to, we'll look at the Hebrew.
Okay, you want it in English?
Yeah, can you read it in
Okay.
English?
So in English, Mishnah, just as the prayer leader is obligated in the prayer of Rosh Hashanah, so too each and every individual is obligated in these prayers. The Gemara, Rabban Gamliel said to the rabbis, according to your statement, why does the prayer leader descend before the ark and recite the Amidah prayer? They said to him, he does so to fulfill the obligation of one who is not an expert in prayer.
Okay, and what that meant generally, historically, was actually someone who couldn't read, right? It's
Yeah.
a fairly new thing that people can read. Everyone, or at most, almost everyone, say in our shul community. So they did it so that people couldn't read could do it themselves, or people who didn't know, it by heart could listen, and like Amy said, you say amen, and then you fulfill your obligation. Nowadays, though, pretty much everyone in the shul is saying it themselves, can read Hebrew. Even if you can't read Hebrew, you can read it in English, you can read the transliteration, or you know it by heart, or what. But most people can say the Amidah themselves. So if so, then why do we say it? What is the point of the repetition nowadays when most people can read? Or pretty much everyone? Any ideas? Ellen, did you want to?
So I'm sure this isn't the intention, but
Yeah.
I very much appreciated it. It gives me the freedom to focus on the specific pieces of the Amidah that I want to focus on any given day, and not miss the whole Amidah.
Oh, interesting. So you do that, you're saying in the repetition is the time that you have more time to focus on?
No, the private time is when I focus on.
You're saying having the private time, and then what's the purpose? So in the private time, you can focus on what you want to focus on, and then what happens during the repetition?
That's the entire, that's the survey course. That's the entire.
So in other words, you pick out particular things to focus on in the personal prayers, and then the repetition is everything, is sort of the summary, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, okay. I think we'll see some sources later on that touch on this a bit, like the idea that if you have personal prayers, then that's added in the first part, right? And then the communal is more, the repetition is more set, right? So I definitely think we'll see that. Any other ideas?
We actually have a question in the chat from Sarah.
Yeah, go ahead. Sarah raised her
Sarah
hand.
was
Go ahead.
asking, I think she prefers that we read it, so I'll just ask it and then
Okay.
Sarah can decide if she's still. She said, why start with a premise that the leader is obligated? And Sarah, if you want to speak out loud, of course you
Yeah,
can.
Sarah, maybe you can, I don't understand the question.
Hi. Sorry, it's just tricky. I'm sitting in a coffee shop, so there are two of me. And I hope you can
Good
hear
to
me.
hear
Okay.
you. Good to hear your voice in any case.
It's good to hear yours. I'm Sarah Rudolph. I was supposed to say that in Cleveland in a Starbucks. So I was wondering, first of all, so the question that I asked in the chat, I was curious at the starting point of the Mishnah. I haven't looked at it beforehand, but the premise that the Shliach Tzibor is obligated, and then we have to say based on, and then we have to say, oh, and also everybody is obligated. Just seems to me.
Right.
And I also would have a suggestion for the question of why we still do it. It's not so much an answer, maybe, but another question or link to the same question, maybe the same, whatever the reason is, that we still say Kaddish in Shul on Friday night in a lot of places. I know in Israel.
That's a very good point. Right.
But we kind of maintain these communal things for whatever reason. I don't know if that's a good reason or, just begs the further question, why do we do that? Which is a question.
It does, but you're not the only one to make that connection. That is, I don't think I included it in the sources, but that connection is also made elsewhere. It's a very similar thing. The practice of saying Kiddush Friday night in shul, in case there are people who don't say it at home, is a similar idea, and it is also given as a parallel, which you're right, doesn't really solve it doesn't exactly answer our question, but it shows that it happens elsewhere, right? And then say, oh, well, because some people might say, oh, well, then why do we do Kiddush? The same question applies there. But we definitely see that, I guess, one thing we can take from that is that once these practices are established, and sometimes they stay, which is what we'll see what the Shulchan Aruch says, basically. Any other comments before we go on? Nancy? Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. Hey, Nancy. Good to see
Hi,
you.
Rachel. I actually have laryngitis, so it's a little hard to speak, but I just want to say, I find it interesting that, or maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, but like being an expert in prayer is somebody who can read the prayer, but there's nothing set to talk about understanding like what the prayer is versus just being able to read it.
Right, which is not to be taken for granted. Right, while
exactly.
people may often be able to say the Hebrew, that doesn't mean that they understand it.
Right.
Maybe they have an English translation, but yeah, that's a good question, which isn't brought up so much. Meaning, I don't think that the meaning of expert, I don't know. I haven't seen that it meant to understand the prayers, but that's also a good question. But the repetition doesn't really help for that. That's the other piece. In other words, that's why we know that that's not what the expert is talking about, because the repetition is not helping the person who doesn't understand the Hebrew, but it is a good question.
Although once you do the reading of it, but personally, while they're doing the repetition, you could actually go and look at the English meaning.
Right. In other words, if you were totally focused on just getting through the Hebrew during your own Amidah, then you could use the repetition as a time to read over the English. That's true. Yeah, that's true. And Sarah, sorry, I didn't get to your first question. That is a good question, and it is addressed in the Mishnah, but we're not going to go into it now because it's a whole the question about why the premise of the prayer leading, but we're not going to get into it now. But I will maybe address it in another.
I wanted to answer Nancy's question, or a possible answer. At least this happens to me with my Hebrew wasn't so great. I mean, sometimes maybe you didn't get it the first time around, but maybe the second time around, you get more understanding of it because you have to hear it and hear it. It's sort of like that Winston Churchill thing that you talk about later here. Like tell them again, tell them you told them, like that. So I think it does help with understanding, actually.
That's a good point. Right, that repeating it gives more of a chance to get the words, and maybe not only just the words, maybe also the meaning, right? Meaning the more personal meaning, significance, right? Maybe I didn't have a chance to think about, some connection, and I think about it the second time. So it could be opportunity both to understand the actual language and also to understand on a more, the significance kind of level. Yeah, anything else before we go on? Anyone I missed? Linda, did you have a hand?
I just wanted to comment that we don't read the Kedushah when we do the silent Amidah. So that's an opportunity during the repetition to do that. That's meant to be said all together communally. So that's a different piece of it too.
Exactly. So actually, that is, you want to read? This is what the Torah.
I don't have it in front of me, so.
Yeah, it's right here. Do you see what I'm sharing?
No, I can't get to the page.
Okay. So the Torah Orach Chaim, the Torah says that the Chazan also repeats the Amidah so that people will say the Kedushah after him. In other words, maybe another reason is that it gives us the opportunity to say the Kedushah. And the Aruch HaShulchan adds to that. That's not the only piece that we only do in the repetition of the Amidah. We also have he mentions the priestly blessing. Other people mention the modim de Rabbanan, the piece of the sort of the parallel modim that we say. So that's another possible answer. And what we are going to look in depth next class, we're going to talk about the priestly blessing. the Birkat Kohanim, and hopefully we'll also get a chance to talk about the Kedushah. So we'll see, like, why would we repeat the entire Amidah just to say the Kedushah and to say the priestly blessing? So that's a very good point. But it still sort of begs the question, like, why are we doing the rest of it? We could just do the Kedushah, you know, or we don't have to do the whole thing. Oops. Why is it doing that? Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. Amy, actually, since this, not Amy, who was talking about the, anyway, does someone want to read the Shulchan Aruch? This is sort of the, or Sarah, you want to read it? Can you read it in the coffee house? Or you, this is what sort of along the lines of what you were saying about the Kiddush. Can you read it? No. Okay. Someone else want to read it?
If you can hear me, okay, I'm happy to read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Tell me again where I'm reading. I didn't hear
Right
you.
here, after the congregation finishes their prayer.
After the congregation finishes their prayer, i.e. the Amidah, the prayer leader repeats the prayer. So that if there's anyone who does not know how to pray the Amidah, that person will pay attention to what the prayer leader is saying and fulfill that person's obligation through that.
So that's what we saw through the Mishnah. Okay. Now becomes the question we've just been discussing: what happens when basically everybody knows the Amidah and can pray it themselves? Okay.
Am I still reading?
Yeah, keep going. Yeah, you can read the, you can read the rest of the source if it's okay.
I just don't know what the background noise might be like here. A congregation which prayed the Amidah, all of them are experts in prayer themselves. Nevertheless, the prayer leader should lead and repeat the Amidah prayer in order to maintain the decree of our sages.
Okay, so how would you explain that? What does that mean to maintain the decree of our sages?
Right? Like it's right? Like this is how we established to do it. So sometimes we're doing it even though we fell away.
Right. It's the practice of our ancestors' tradition, basically, right? Like this is what we've always done. This is what we're going to keep on doing, even if maybe the original reason doesn't apply anymore. Okay, you want to keep going? Which might be the reason for Kiddush also, by the way, right? Even if everyone in our shul says Kiddush at home. Okay, so we still do it in the shul because that's what we always did.
Well, also at the Pesach Seder, remember when we say, even if all of us are brilliant and all of us know everything and all of us are scholars, you still are obligated to recite the Haggadah.
Right, even if we already all know it. Mm-hmm. Interesting parallel. Okay, interesting. Okay. Yeah, Sarah, you want to keep going?
When the prayer leader repeats the Amidah prayer, the congregation should be quiet and focused on the blessings Hazan was making and respond to me. If there are not 9 people who are focusing on the prayer leader's blessings, it is almost as prayer leader's blessings are made. Therefore, each person should ask as if there are not 9 others who are focusing other than that person and should focus on the blessings of Hazan.
Okay, just finish up now.
For every blessing that a person hears in any place, one says, "Blessed is God and blessed is His name." And if they answer Amen after every blessing, both the people who already and they answer Amen after every blessing, both the people who already fulfilled their obligation to pray and those who did not. And the intention that one should hold in one's heart is the blessing that the blesser recited is true, and I believe it. 7, one should not hold a mundane conversation at the time when the prayer leader is repeating Amidah prayers. And if a person verses on common matters, that person sins, and that person's transgression is too great to bear, and we rebuke that person. Ouch.
Exactly. Ouch. Exactly. So we could see from here, obviously, he would not be saying this if people were all quiet and listening during the Amidah. Clearly, he felt the need to say, "You're in trouble. Your transgression is too great to bear," and we rebuke that person if you're talking during the Amidah. So we see here that there are a whole series of laws about the repetition, right? It's not just, even though he says at the beginning, we want to maintain the decree of our sages, and that was originally about just fulfilling those people who don't know how to say the Amidah themselves to fulfill their thing. But all these new laws seem to be going a step further, right? All these laws that he's talking about, we need to be quiet, we need to focus. And if there aren't 9 people focusing, then it's almost as if the prayer is in vain. In other words, the Amidah requires there'd be 10 people focusing on it. And we need to say, blessed is God and blessed is his name, and we need to answer Amen. And we need to be holding in our heart that the blessing received is true, and we need to not be talking, which clearly was a problem even back then. So like, what do you think he's getting at in all these different laws? In other words, it seems like it's more than just maintaining the decree of our sages.
Well, maybe the Amen part is like you're committing to the fact that you believe it out loud, which a lot of like sociology says if you're going to change your behavior is really important. Like you declare publicly that you believe this, that you're somehow, I don't know, incorporated in your life or something like that, which is different than just sort of mumbling it along on your own.
Ah, that's interesting. So this is the public declaration. I like that.
From what their number 6 says, sounds like that's the intention.
In other words, you're not just saying it for yourself, but you're saying for everybody to know.
Yep.
That, and by making that public declaration, it's more likely that you're saying will internalize it and act on it, and not just saying it, which I think is an interesting point about communal prayer in general, right? Like how much of it is a public declaration, right? In some ways, just like the act of going to shul, right? And is a public declaration. You could just, if you're praying in your own, it's a very different kind of thing than going to shul and making a public declaration to your community, as it were.
Right.
Yeah, Nancy.
I was just going to say, at a much more simplistic level, you have to be listening to be able to know when to say Amen and know when to say the blessed be God bless. So it keeps you focused because you have to listen to know when to say these.
Yeah, and they clearly think it's important that you're focused. Right?
Exactly. Because you got to be
and that you're not right. So which again brings to the question, why is it so important that you're focused? And that there need to be at least 10 people focusing, or it doesn't count. Which is the original reason, the only person, according to the original reason that the Mishnah gives, the only person who needs to be focusing really is the person who didn't say it themselves, who didn't know how to say it themselves. But here they're saying, in order for it to like work, to be effective, there need to be 10 people focusing. And right, the Amen keeps you focused. Yeah, but then the question becomes, why do there need to be 10 people focusing for this prayer to work? Right? Like, if otherwise the blessings are in vain. Yeah, did someone want to say something?
I was just starting to think if there are 2 different things going on. Right? On one hand, originally it was said for the benefit, it was repeated for the benefit of those who couldn't necessarily say it themselves, but at the same time, it's the shliach tzibur, right? The communal leader, so you need a tzibur to, I don't know, like justify, let's say, that repetition. Because otherwise, if he already said his own Amidah, and now he's saying it again, so like what justifies that repetition? If not that it's a communal thing. So for that, you need the full community kind of attending, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Very interesting. Right. So you're saying the shliach tzibur himself is repeating it, right? He said it himself, and now he's saying it again. And in order to justify that repetition, right, that it's not a blessing in vain, it has to be a community prayer. There has to be something different about it. There has to be a different quality of it, in that it's a community prayer. And the way that it becomes a community prayer is for 10 people to be focusing on it, right? Yes, according to Amy's question, people in that time probably meant men, but we won't get into that now. But the community had to be focusing in order to make it a community prayer. Otherwise, it's a blessing in vain. So there's something about it that is inherently communal, which isn't clear from the first reason of the Mishnah. Yeah, Dad, you want to say something?
the sort of obligatory part of this is interesting because it's almost sounds as if the Shliach Tzibur has a responsibility to the 10 people, to the congregants, to make it interesting enough that they will focus, and they have an obligation to be focused. So both the person saying the repetition plus the people listening to it have sort of a motivation to pay attention, to have more of a part in it, and not, it would be remiss of them to drift off, which of course is always a risk during this part of the service.
Right. So it's very interesting. It's not only the prayer leader, the Shliach Tzibur's responsibility. It's just as much everyone else who's sitting there's responsibility. Maybe not just that, but it seems like basically they have almost as much, or perhaps even as much, responsibility as the prayer leader himself in making this prayer not in vain and making it a meaningful prayer. In other words, it's a prayer that requires a community. Sorry, had you wanted to add some response, or you're okay? I saw your thing was still on. I think she's good. Yeah, Linda?
Well, it just occurred to me, a lot of times we do like a Chetzi Kedusha. We don't do a full repetition. I mean, how does that fit in with all this? Is that really legal to do it that way, or
yeah, we're not going to get into that question. There are exceptional situations where we don't do the whole entire thing, mainly when we're pressed for time, meaning it's not supposed to be the ideal, right? But there are times that we do it, but it's like it's not the ideal. It's like we're pressed for time. We're not going to get into the question, but it's an interesting question. But what I did want to just along those lines, so the responsa of the Radbaz quotes Maimonides, who not only quotes Maimonides' son, who speaks about how his father, that to talking had gone so bad in his time that he actually did abolish the repetition of the Amidah. In other words, he didn't just go for the Kedushah, which is done in some places, right? But he abolished the entire Amidah. He said he saw that the Chazan repeated the Amidah out loud after the silent Amidah. People did not listen to the repetition with fear, awe, and humility while they stand in prayer, but rather speak idle chatter. This is a great stumbling block because people speak while the Chazan is praying and do not listen to him with awe and morality. And this ridicules the honor of heaven. And they think, like, the reason that they give is that they already fulfilled their obligation with the silent Amidah, and they have no need for the repetition of the Amidah. So basically, he did something somewhat similar to the Heicha Kedushah, right? He said that the Chazan should raise his voice at the beginning of the Amidah in order to fulfill the obligation of anyone who is not an expert, and the rest of the people will pray themselves to fulfill their own obligation. You should say Kedushah at the third blessing, and the people should respond, and then they should all pray together until they finish the Amidah together. Not sure exactly what he means by that, but it's somewhat of a variation, right? We don't do a repetition, we do it all together. Ultimately, this is not accepted halachically, but it's interesting that we see there was such a big problem that the Rambam himself said we just should do away with it because people just aren't acting respectfully, so we should get rid of it. Ultimately, that's not the way history goes, but it's important to note it, and it does have some, like, there are some implications for modern halacha in the sense of what you mentioned, that in certain situations we do the Heicha Kedushah in certain non-ideal situations. Okay, but ultimately that's not the way halacha goes, and the Kaf HaChaim even goes a step further. Someone want to read it? Anyone want to read it? Just calling somebody.
I'm happy to read, but I also don't need to be the only one.
Okay, go ahead.
More than right there.
Go ahead, next time we'll give someone else.
In the days of the Arizal, permission was given to reveal, and the secret of the repetition of the Amidah was revealed, that its greatness is higher than the silent Amidah, and both are obligatory. Therefore, the Arizal would close his eyes and listen, focusing on the words of the Chazan. Therefore, the repetition of the Amidah should never be nullified.
Okay, so this is basically from a Kabbalistic perspective, right? The Arizal, right, we're talking about Kabbalistic. So I don't really, I don't know what the secret is and what was revealed exactly, but he's saying that according to the Arizal, it's not only that it's obligatory and that it shouldn't be nullified, as the Rambam tried to do, but that its greatness is actually higher than the silent Amidah, which is very interesting. In other words, in some level, the repetition of the Amidah is even more important, more holy than the silent Amidah. Any ideas why that might be? That it's not only sort of equally obligatory, but even more so. Not necessarily more obligatory, but more holy in some way.
So I don't claim to know anything about Kabbalah, but
neither do I.
I got to read a series on the virtual Beit Midrash online a couple of years ago about prayer, like different perspectives on philosophy of prayer through the ages. And I was very taken by some of the Kabbalistic perspectives that, I read and may or may not have understood there. But some of it was really like some, I don't remember the Ari specifically, some for sure messed them up, but there were ideas like that the meanings of the words, like don't even pay attention to the meanings of the words, just say them and they have their own power and, things like that. And I can imagine that, from that sort of perspective, that the more people you have, like the more, sparks you're collecting or whatever it is that that's happening through that. And the more you're, connecting to the higher realms or opening pathways to the higher, whatever that is, I can imagine that any of that could be, stronger with more people.
Right. The more people, the more powerful on sort of a spiritual, mystical level. And it's also a very important point you make, like, according to that, maybe it doesn't even matter that in some ways that understand the meaning of, like, we've been talking a lot about understanding the meaning of the words. Maybe there's some like power of saying the words that doesn't even totally matter if you understand the translation, right? Just in some ways saying the words and having 10 people together say the words, all the more so, all the more powerful. Yeah. Anyone else want to add something in terms of why it would be greater or higher than the silent Amidah? Okay. So Rabbi Weiss, Rabbi Avi Weiss, now we're going to move. So since, like Sarah, I don't really understand very much about Kabbalah, I want to try to understand this in a way that I can understand it. Maybe hopefully you guys do. So I'm going to bring in turn to some modern thinkers, contemporary thinkers for the most part, to try to understand like what could it be about the repetition of the Amidah? Because I think most of the time we don't think about it this way, but the repetition of the Amidah is even more holy than the silent Amidah, because normally it's hard to focus. We're talking, as we've seen. So I want to first look at Rav Avi. Can I just call on somebody? And if you don't want to read, you don't have to read. Here, Ellen, you want to read the Rav Avi Weiss?
Sure. Holistic prayer. This intensely private moment of the silent Amidah is followed by the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, which reminds us that no matter how personal our needs may be, we're part of a larger peoplehood, its celebrations and challenges. Thus, the repetition is not the prayer of an individual, but a prayer of collective individuality. The leader of the service becomes the embodiment of all those assembled. Disparate people coming from different places with different needs pause, reflect, and join, becoming a collective whole, a unity of souls. It may be best to use a term other than repetition of the Shemona Esrei to describe the leader's reading of the Amidah. Repetition has its value. Winston Churchill purportedly said, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Still, the term repetition is problematic, as congregants may feel there's no need to listen, since the Shemona Esrei has already been said.
Right,
Rather,
which is
this-
exactly what the Rambam said, hundreds of years ago, right? They're like, why do we need to listen? We already said it. Okay,
Well,
keep going.
Except that, rather, this part of the service should be viewed as a renewal of the Shemona Esrei. While the words are nearly the same as the silent one, they're new, as we mentally focus on community rather than individual.
Yeah, did you want to say something, Anna?
Well, I was just thinking of the root shin nun hey, which is Mishnah and teaching, is not repetition, but also teaching. No, not so much.
Yes, it's just not
Well,
the word.
Shinantam Levanecha from the Shema.
Yes, yeah, there is, I think, yes, I would say.
So,
yeah,
I mean, it's not, it's repetition, but it's a higher order.
higher order. Yeah, exactly. What do you mean by that?
It's not just drudgery. It's not rote repetition. It's it has significance and weight, and it really is working to accomplish something significant.
A little bit brings me back to Amy's comment at the beginning of class about the Haggadah, right? We say, even if you've heard this story a million times, we do it again, right? And each time is different, right? We don't want to think and each time has its own significance, right? It's a story we've heard again and again and again and again. But ideally, I like what Rav Avi says, that it's a renewal, not a repetition, but a renewal. Even though you don't have to think of repetition as a bad thing, I agree. But it's a nice way of thinking about it, like a twist. So this is a renewal, that we say the same thing, but with a different focus. And what is the different focus? The different focus is community. Okay, the first one, right? And Rav Avi talks about earlier in this chapter. He talks about how if we want to put in like our personal prayers, we put that in the silent Amidah. And the repetition of the Amidah, our intention is for the community, and we're praying as a community. So that brings us to the question of the course, right? What about praying with the community is a higher order, even in some ways, right, than praying as individuals? In other words, what are we gaining with this second prayer, this second repetition, renewal of the Amidah, that is focused on community and not just on individuals? Obviously, the individual part is important, and we did that in the first, in our personal Amidah. But what are we gaining in this second Amidah? In other words, what are we gaining by this part that is just focused just about community? Why is it important? Why are we? Is the question clear? In other words, why is praying with the intention? Why is praying for the community and together with the community? Why is that as of a higher order, and why is that important enough to warrant an entire repetition of that midah?
Well, I think it strengthens our connections to the community and to each other. It strengthens our sense of ourselves as a people, as a unifying people. And it kind of draws on that more so than when you were doing your own individual prayer. We're all saying the same thing at the same time. So there's something powerful about that.
Right. Yes, we'll definitely see that later. The idea that it's connecting us one to another. It's building the community. It's uniting us. Yeah, definitely. Any other?
I'll just say,
Nancy.
just if something doesn't pertain, some prayer particularly doesn't pertain to you individually, it probably does affect somebody in that community. So it makes you realize that it isn't about you. It's truly about everybody in that community. And, certain things, again, that don't pertain to you would definitely pertain to somebody else. And it just makes you more aware of the fact that it really is not about you.
Yeah. I mean, it is about you, but not only,
Oh, yeah,
right?
not only, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, say right now, I'm not in particularly need of healing, think
Right,
my kids
exactly.
are doing well right now. So the healing is not particularly speaking to me on a personal level right now, but for sure there's someone else in the community who
Exactly.
their family need healing right now. And that
It
when
gives
I
you an
pray,
awareness.
what did you say, Nancy? Sorry?
An awareness of those around you that, there are a lot of people suffering and whatever the issue is.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. You want to read Rav Soloveitchik? Because that's exactly along the
If
lines.
it's not long, because I'm trying to keep my voice.
Oh, someone
just
else can read.
voice.
I don't want to hurt your voice.
Yeah.
Here. Linda, you want to read the Rav Soloveitchik?
Unmute myself. Okay. When the I becomes aware of his being responsible for the well-being of the thou, a new community emerges, the community of prayer. What does this mean? It means a community of common pain, of common suffering. The halakha has taught the individual to include his fellow man in his prayer. The individual must not limit himself to his own needs, no matter how pressing those needs are and how distinguished he is. Halakha has formulated prayer in the plural.
Right, which is interesting because actually the personal prayer is also in the plural. Meaning when we do the silent Amidah, it's also mainly in the plural. But I think this is very much along the lines of what Nancy is saying, that when I pray for the community, I become aware of the different needs of people in my community. I'm not only focused on my own needs, but I sort of reach outward and I think about what other people need and I pray for them. Yeah, does anyone have anything else they want to add in terms of the question of the communal?
I found it interesting that he should not only say that the individual's personal needs are not everything, but he emphasizes how, because you think of yourself as distinguished and important, well, maybe that's, when you're with a group of other individuals, your personal importance is not so important. It has to be a community thing as opposed to, just because you're the richest guy in the minyan doesn't mean that you are the most important one.
In other words, it's a reminder to be humble.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I would say, you want to read Rav Zinger? It's a reminder to be humble, and it's a reminder that we're not everything, right? You want to read what he says? I don't know if people know, I haven't been giving biographies of everybody, but Rav Zinger, we looked at him in the last class that I did on prayer. He's a contemporary Jewish thinker and rabbi, and he does a lot of really interesting stuff. Living in Israel, head of Makor Chaim, the high school, and he does a lot of interesting stuff about sort of about making prayer meaningful again, basically. He does workshops, he does all sorts of interesting things. Anyway, okay, you want to read it, Dad?
Sure.
The communal prayer?
Communal prayer is not an individual's prayer said amongst others. Rather, it has a character and quality all its own. The key offering of communal prayer is the ability to open our hearts to see ourselves not as private people, but rather as part of an entire organism, to release us from the hold we have on ourselves, on our needs. It is not by chance that our prayer is worded in the plural, because prayer's main tenet is the inner ability to rise above our solitude and be part of a whole, one with the community. The first gate of connection to the community of which we are part is to fill our heart with love.
Yeah. So it's saying a couple things. One is, I think, along the lines of what you were saying, that to release us from the hold we have on ourselves and our needs. Sort of let go a little bit of our self-centeredness, right? Again, not that our needs are important and they also have a place and we should be praying for them, and that's important. But we also have to have a time that we release that and we say, I'm not everything. I'm part of a larger whole, part of a larger community. I'm not alone in this world. I'm part of a whole, one with the community. And then the last part was interesting. I think it was having to do with, was it Linda who was saying? It was Linda, right? You were talking about how sort of the prayer connects us to one another. It was you, right? Right, that is saying that the first gate of connection to the community of which we are part is to fill our heart with love. That like actually praying for each other and with each other can help us love each other more. And it's interesting. I don't know if anyone here davens prays Nusach Sfard, but the Ashkenazi, they don't do this. I don't think I don't do it. But in the Sephardi Nusach, at the very beginning of prayer, we say, and you should love your fellow as yourself. Before a person sets his prayer in the synagogue, he should accept himself on himself the commandment of, and you should love your fellow as yourself. So this is actually part of the prayer, is that we say, you should love your fellow as yourself. And have in mind to love every Jew as himself, for through this, his prayer will include all the prayers of Israel and rise up high and give fruit. In other words, like that's our intention. That's a way of setting our intention before we even start praying, is to remind ourselves of this mitzvah of loving our neighbor as oneself. And somehow, and that will enable us to pray for everyone. And I would add, sort of along the lines of what Linda's saying, that will help our prayer strengthen us in our ability to do the mitzvah of loving our neighbor as oneself. That makes sense. I think this is it's a beautiful idea to start your prayer that way. I hadn't heard of it before this, but it's yeah. And Rav Avi also adds, right, that what ultimately, what's the point of recognizing other people's needs? Like, where are we going with all that? Like, why is it important to feel part of a community, to recognize other people's needs? What is, where are we going with that? What's the ultimate goal? And maybe that's a goal in of itself. That's also true. To sort of be emotionally more aware of other people's needs and to feel myself as part of the community and to feel loving of other people. Yes, Sarah? Yes.
But I think I remember seeing somewhere in the past, I don't remember what sources, but maybe Rambam, but I could be making that up. But or seeing the idea that when we come together, I mean, it sounds a little bit selfish, but when we come together, that like it sort of blurs the lines of our own misdeeds and our own flaws, and we kind of, approach Hashem as a better whole, right? And that we're more likely to be answered.
Yes. Yes, exactly. We'll get to that actually later in a later class. We'll get to that in a later class. That's in other words, so I might have this flaw and this flaw and this flaw, but I'm joined together as a whole sort of overcomes in some ways the flaws of any one individual, right? Is that what you're saying, sort of?
Which is not as nice as, love your neighbor as yourself. I don't care about it.
Right, it's more selfish because in the end, I'm still trying to get my prayer answered, right?
Coming to it is like, well, here, let my good qualities help you out over there. I feel like that's also not so nice, but.
Right, but in other words, like the sum of the whole is larger than the parts, right? Am I saying it the right way? That if If we all pray together, then we're much more likely to get answered, because anyone, right? If I in my own fault, my own flawed self come to God, then I'm less likely to get answered if the whole community comes together. Yeah, Mom, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, it seems like Rabbi Weiss is also saying something to do with Tikkun Olam, that we are partners with God in making the world a better place.
Yeah, you want to read number 11?
Sure. The silent Amidah, the Amidah of the murmuring voice, may be an example of prayer as reliance. When the human being stands submissively before God, dependent upon Him, the repetition of the Amidah of words, may reflect prayer as responsibility, when the human being asserts his or her role in helping God redeem the world.
Yeah, so this is actually a footnote. And originally when I read it, I didn't really understand it. But then when I thought more about this idea of like praying as a community, actually helping strengthen our resolve to love our fellow as ourselves, it makes more sense. In other words, if prayer helps me recognize the needs of the other and sense the needs of the other and love the other person, then the next step is that I then take responsibility to, like you said, to do tikkun olam, to help God redeem the world. And that it's actually also an action plan, as it were. So all this, I think, I want to read Rav Weiss as a summary, and then I think maybe we'll also have time to do the last three sources. But Rav Weiss is an interesting summary of the idea. So we started off with the Kabbalistic idea of the Arizal, that something about the communal Shemona Esrei, the repetition of the Amidah is actually holier. And Rav Avi actually speaks about this in musical terms. And he says in his footnote, and since I know him, I want to say it, that he got this idea of the higher octave Amidah from Rav Ari Hart, who's a good friend of ours. So we should give him credit. Someone want to read the second quote, the next quote from Rav Avi? Just say. Nancy, you want to read it? Oh, not you, sorry.
Yeah,
Not Nancy. Linda, you want to read the prayer?
next time.
Yeah, I forgot. I was like here.
Okay, number 12 you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Prayer is song, prayer of prayers, song of songs. This is the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, what the rabbis call tefillah. Using the metaphor of melody, the Shemona Esrei said aloud by the leader of the service can be called the higher octave Amidah. The musical cycle contains 7 notes, popularly sung do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. There is, however, an 8th note, do. The 8th is the same as the first, except that it is sung 1 octave higher. Thus, the Klei Yakar maintains all of Moses' songs begin with az. Then, a Hebrew word with the numerical value of 8, as the songs were all-encompassing, all-inspiring, going beyond the 7-note scale, reaching a higher plane. The communal Shemona Esrei represents the next cycle, this higher octave. It is similar to the silent Amidah, and yet it is significantly different. It is higher as it manifests the yearnings, the hopes, the aspirations, the angst, and the dreams, not only of the individual, but of the whole community of Israel. The communal Shemona Esrei rides the back of the silent one, becoming the prayer of the higher octave Amidah.
Yeah, so I think he sort of goes back to what we saw with the Kaf HaChaim, the quote from the Arizal about it being higher. But he explains it in language that for me is more understandable, right? That why is it higher? It manifests the yearnings, the hopes, right? It's a repetition, but it's higher, right? We're doing it sort of like circles, right? And spiraling upwards, right? So it manifests the yearnings, the hopes, the aspirations, the angst and dreams, not only of the individual, but of the whole community of Israel. And because of that, it's higher because it's joining everyone together. We have a few more minutes. Okay. I don't know if we're going to be able to, I think we're going to have to leave a couple of these sources for next time. All right. But I just wanted to, right, I wanted to look closely again at this question of what does it mean to ask for compassion, to pray on behalf of somebody else, okay? And this might also, I don't know if you were also thinking along these lines, Sarah, says, it's a little bit different than what you were saying, but anyone who asks for compassion from heaven on behalf of another, and he requires the same thing, he is answered first. As it is written, and the Lord changed the fortune of Job when he prayed for his friends. In other words, if I ask something for someone else, then I'm answered. Then I'm answered. God answers me first. Like there's something better about me asking for somebody else than about me asking for myself. So Rav Zinger says, it is often very difficult for us to pray for ourselves with all of our might. We get all complicated. I'm not comfortable asking. I don't really deserve it. I can deal with it on my own. There's something freeing about praying for another. It's not me, it's my friend. I'm not doing this for myself. And this allows me to put all my strength into the prayer. By asking my friend to pray for me, I release my grip on the problem and give it over to my friend. Somebody else is carrying my baggage, relieving me of the weight for a moment. I'm not alone. When I pray for my friend, I'm essentially expressing my readiness to take their troubles from them, to take responsibility for them for a while, to deal with things for them. I reach out a hand and pray. So in other words, that it's often sometimes even easier to pray for another person, right? Like I don't feel comfortable asking for things for myself. I feel like I want to pretend that I don't need things, right? But for my friend, I can ask and I can really put my heart into it. And on the other hand, it's also like very freeing that I can have somebody else pray, give my problems over to my friend for him to ask about. And to give let somebody else pray for me for a while. And right. So like we're taking responsibility for each other's troubles, which I really like that thing. And I'm just going to end with this poem because I love it so much. And we actually read it in our course last year, but I want to read it again because I really like it. And we're going to end with that since we're out of time. Everyone needs someone to pray for him, someone whose lips will utter his name in faith and hope and life to revive someone else. And everyone needs a heart on which to place hands in faith and blessing. And everyone needs someone else and needs to go out and go in and mainly to go beyond and forget himself. And for a bit to go in and for a bit to be someone else for an hour, for a day, for a cry, to be someone else. Everyone needs to stand before his God and to cry out enough, no more. Let him be. He's pure gold. He is a precious gem. He is your son, your one and only. Give him good, visible, and revealed. Give him also the ability to pray. Help him pray for someone else. So I'm going to end with that. We'll continue talking about this, but end with the blessing that everyone should be able to pray for other people and have other people pray for them. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much.
you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you
Thank
to
you, Rachel.
everyone else who joined us today and being part of a learning community. Just a reminder that our fall Zman classes are still open for registration. As always, you can sign up at drisha.org/classes. And thank you so much again, Rachel, and we'll see each other next time. Lehitraot.